persuaded Mum for me to tell my siblings, which I did, and
Children went to school to learn and socialise rather than spend time with their friends. And a BBC investigation has found that many patients in England are stuck on hidden NHS waiting lists. People who have been referred to a specialist are no longer counted on the main waiting list, even if they need further treatment.
Thanks very much, Charles. Let's go to Simon in sport.
Thanks, Johnny. In football's Premier League, Manchester United beat Luton Town 2-1 at Kenilworth Road, while the bottom club Sheffield United lost 5-0 at home to Brighton. There's one match in the Premiership tonight. Everton, who are third from bottom, play Crystal Palace at Goodison Park. In the Scottish Premiership, Rangers won 3-0 at St Johnstone. In the Women's Super League, level wins for Liverpool, Everton, Aston Villa and Leicester City. But we're going to talk Rugby League now, with the Super League season having just got underway. Reigning champions Wigan Warriors kicked off their 2024 campaign with a 32-4 win over Castleford Tigers. But with the first round of fixtures completed, St Helens are top of the table after 40 points to 4 humbling London Broncos. Now here to discuss what is an interesting time for the sport is Rhodri Jones, Managing Director of Rugby League Commercial. Morning, Rhodri.
Morning, Sam.
Pleasure. Let's start with the good news. Record attendances. The total figure across the 6 games was nearly 77,000. It's 10% more than any other 6-game opening round. What should you put that down to?
It's been a fantastic start to Super League 2024. As you say, over 76,000 attendees over that first round, including over 20,000 at the open on Thursday night at the MKM Stadium. What do I put it down to? Anticipation, optimism, and just a sense of good things are happening in the sport right now. And that continues again this weekend with the Betfred World Cup Challenge this Saturday, live on BBC Two and Sky Sports with a sellout £24,000 as Wigan Warriors take on the Penrith Panthers.
Now, you mentioned the BBC there. Rugby League Commercial have signed a TV deal with the BBC, which sees Super League matches live on BBC TV and on the iPlayer for the first time. How big a deal is that for the sport?
Oh, it's significant, Simon. It's a fantastic new addition, complementing our long-standing Sky Sports relationship that gives Super League the profile and audience it's never had before. But it's not just the broadcast on BBC Two. If you go on the BBC Sport website and app this morning, you can see the highlights from all 6 matches from the weekends and clips on the social media platforms from a spectacular try on Friday night and a Tarek Sims lead tackle from Kirkion on Saturday night as well.
Yeah. So those are the good things, but a big talking point is around the laws of the game and how they're being enforced. There's obviously a big focus on player welfare, resulting in a clampdown on high tackles and head collisions. The result of that being 4 red cards in the first round, which is the same number as was brandished in Australia's NRL in the entirety of their 2023 season. So this tackle issue is a really big talking point that's definitely splitting opinion amongst fans, isn't it?
Yeah, and I can understand that, and it goes without saying round 1 was, it was without drama, and as you say, incident. There are new law interpretations for the start of the season to ensure the game remains safe for all to play. And as you say, especially around the brain health. And unfortunately, some players did fall foul of the new interpretations, which meant we did see a number of cards being shown. But, we're confident that that will only get better as the players get used to those interpretations.
Okay. Rhodri Jones, thanks for talking to the Today programme. Let's go to the tips, both at Carlisle, 3:30 number 1 RS Ambush and 4 o'clock number 1 Houston, Texas.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's 25 minutes to 9. The family of Alexei Navalny have been trying to get access to his body. His spokesperson says turned away this morning. Meanwhile, his death raises questions about where the opposition is left and indeed why Mr. Putin and his government may have acted in this way. Steve Rosenberg's our Russia editor. He's in Moscow. Steve, good morning. Still no access for the family to Alexei Navalny's body?
No, it seems that way. I mean, on social media a short while ago, Mr. Navalny's spokesperson said that Alexei Navalny's mother and his lawyer arrived again at the mortuary in the town of Salihar. That's the main town near the penal colony, right on the Arctic Circle. But they hadn't been allowed to go in, and it still hasn't been confirmed to them even that Mr. Navalny's body is there. The spokesperson also said that Mr. Nawalny's mother had been informed by Russia's investigative committee that the investigation into his death had been extended and that the cause of death was still unknown.
There's a lot of questions rumbling around the past few days about what Mr. Navalny's death means for what remains of the opposition in Russia. I'm sure you've had a lot of time to ponder it yourself. Do you think things have changed as a result of his death?
Well, things were already pretty bad for the Russian opposition before Mr. Navalny's death. When you look at where are the main opposition leaders in Russia, they are either in exile, they've fled abroad, or they're in prison. Mr. Navalny, of course, was in prison himself. Now he's dead, so things are pretty bad. I was out this weekend talking to people who were laying flowers at monuments in memory of Mr. Navalny, to his supporters, and they, of course, are devastated, although they're determined to keep his memory alive. And yet, just chatting to people, even though things are pretty bad, very dark, there's still hope that perhaps things could get better at some point. They still were clinging on to that.
But meanwhile, to lay flowers, to show any kind of protest, that is met with overwhelming firmness.
Yeah, even coming out and laying roses and carnations at a monument is actually quite an act of courage, because there's a big police presence around these monuments. We went to what's known as the Wall of Grief in Moscow, which is a monument commemorating the victims of political persecution under Joseph Stalin. And that's where some Muscovites have been coming to lay these flowers. There was a very large police presence. People had to come through the police to actually go up and lay these flowers. So, quite a courageous act to do.
Steve, thanks very much indeed. Steve Rosenberg on Russia Thanks for
23 minutes to 9 now. The veteran American politician Bernie Sanders, an independent senator on Capitol Hill and a member of the House of Representatives before he joined the Senate, has published a new book. It is called It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. He has come to the UK as part of the promotion, and he joins us now from our Salford studio. Good morning, Senator Sanders.
Morning.
We were talking there about Russia, and I'm struck by the fact that in your book you talk about oligarchy not being a uniquely Russian phenomenon, that it's a global reality that our corporate media chooses to examine in only the narrowest of terms. Explain what you mean by
that. Putin invaded Russia. When Putin invaded Ukraine, it wasn't about Russia and the economics of Russia and the fact that the oligarchs run Russia, but what is not discussed is increasingly in the United States, and in fact, although you have a smaller and smaller number of extraordinarily wealthy people exercise extraordinary power over the global economy and global political. For example, when you tell me how often we discuss this right now, as we speak, the people in the world
Senator
are becoming
Sanders, I'm really sorry.
phenomenally richer.
I'm going to stop you just because there's something wrong with our line and we can't hear you properly. So bear with us. We are going to fix it and we'll come back to you very shortly. Let's turn just for a moment then to another conversations, one about Julian Assange, who begins another attempt tomorrow at a hearing in London to appeal against his extradition to the US. You'll remember that the case against him goes back to WikiLeaks and the release of US classified information by the former soldier Chelsea Manning. I've been speaking to Julian Assange's wife, Stella.
This could very well be the final hearing for Julian in the UK, because if he loses this round, there is no possibility for further appeal in this jurisdiction, and that means that the UK Home Office will then move to extradite him. And we know that in other cases that has been a matter of 24 hours. We are hoping that we'll have time to apply to the European Court of Human Rights and try to get an emergency injunction to stay that extradition, but at the moment it's so uncertain and stakes are so high. If he's extradited to the US, he won't survive it ultimately, so we need to stop it. That's my reading of how things are going to go.
How is he now? Because it's been, nearly 5 years in Belmarsh, high security prison. How's he doing?
Well, it's very difficult for him. Obviously, this period is extremely stressful. He doesn't sleep, he loses his appetite, and he knows that anything could happen next week. Sorry, this week already. Tomorrow and the day after will determine whether he lives or dies, essentially, and he's physically and mentally, obviously, in a very difficult place.
He has the support of his own government, doesn't he? The Australian government, including the Prime Minister, who wants the US and the UK to bring this to an end. Could the UK government bring it to an end? Do they have that within their power?
Well, look, this extradition request should never have been accepted by the UK government because it's an extradition for political offences under the Espionage Act, and that is prohibited under Article 4 of the US-UK extradition treaty. So it should never have even gone to the courts. The previous government was wrong to accept it, and of course the new Home Secretary could review that decision and reach the correct conclusion that it is in violation of their own treaty with the United States.
Why do you think that hasn't happened?
Well, this is a political case. It's politically motivated. The subject matter, which is publishing evidence of state criminality of the country that's trying to extradite Julian, is political. It came about during the Trump administration, who wanted to use Julian's case as a precedent to be able to go after the press under the Espionage Act. This is an unprecedented case. The Espionage Act has never been used against a publisher for receiving information and possessing it and communicating it to the public. And let's remember that Julian is not the whistleblower here. That was Chelsea Manning, who gave Julian the material, gave WikiLeaks the material so it could be published. There's no question about the public interest of that material, which evidenced war crimes, torture, criminality, and so on.
And the Biden administration has continued this, and it seems that are determined to continue with it, despite what the Australian government has asked them to do. There are some MPs supporting your husband, but not that many. And I wonder if you look back on that period in the Ecuadorian embassy, the 7 years that he spent there trying to avoid the extradition request by being there, and think now that that was the wrong thing to do, and that is why you haven't got as much political sympathy as you would have hoped for.
Well, it's easy to look back now and say, well, maybe things would have been different because the Trump administration really was a turning point. At that point, there were even plans to assassinate him. That was in 2017, 2018, when Mike Pompeo was the director of the CIA. But even before that, Chelsea Manning had been in prison for 7 years. There was a lot of very threatening statements coming out of the United States, calling Julian a terrorist, some cable news TV calling for him to be assassinated, and so on. And that's why Ecuador, when they made their determination, it was based on Chelsea Manning's treatment when she was in U.S. custody, which the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said amounted to cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. And actually the new UN Special Rapporteur just last week issued a statement saying Julian should not be extradited from the UK because he risks torturous treatment in the United States.
You said that you believe that there were plans to assassinate him in the UK.
Yes.
What evidence do you have for that?
Well, there was an extensive report with over 30 sources, named and unnamed, from the CIA and the National Security Council in the United States that confirmed that Mike Pompeo was quote-unquote obsessed with Julian and WikiLeaks to bring down WikiLeaks, and that there were even plans that Mike Pompeo directed his agency to elaborate sketches and options about how to assassinate him in the UK. There were also talks about renditioning him, kidnapping him, and so on.
And this report came from whom?
Well, it came from Yahoo News, and Mike Pompeo then said that the sources should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, so not for libel, but for disclosing state secrets. The CIA has refused to comment on it, and the Spanish High Court has summoned Mike Pompeo to be questioned over this report, and he's refused to comply.
Stella Assange, Julian Assange's wife, thank you.
Thanks.
Mike Pompeo, by the way, has denied that report, and he said in 2021 that it makes for pretty good fiction. They should write a novel, referring to Yahoo News where that story first appeared. Now, we can go back, thankfully, to Senator Bernie Sanders. Sorry about earlier, Senator Sanders. My question was about what you said in your book, It's Okay to be Angry About Capitalism, about the oligarchs of America. What's the point you're making?
The point that I'm making is in the United States, and in fact all over the world, we're seeing a very small number of people with incredible wealth and incredible power becoming even more wealthy and more powerful. Today in this world, Michelle, hard to believe, but very rarely discussed, top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 99%. In my country, three people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. And it's not only massive income and wealth inequality, which is outrageous. These people exercise enormous power. We have unprecedented concentration of corporate ownership in America and around the world. You got 3 Wall Street firms that control assets of over $20 trillion and combined control the major stockholders in 95% of the major corporations in America. They have political power. In my country, it means that if you're a billionaire, you can spend as much money as you want. When we talk about democracy, it's not good enough to talk about voting every 4 years or 2 years or whatever it may be. That's fine. That's political democracy. But if we're about people having the ability to control their own lives, making sure that their kids are growing up with dignity and health, what we have got to do is tackle the incredible power of big money. One way you do it certainly is through taxation. Another thing that you do is start breaking up these major corporations and moving toward, among other things, worker ownership of corporate to corporate world.
You are a lone voice on this, not entirely alone, but certainly quite a solitary voice on Capitol Hill.
Well, yes and no. On Capitol Hill, you have a situation where many elected officials are way out of touch with the needs of working people. But I will tell you absolutely that there are millions and millions of people who understand that we have got to look at human rights as economic rights. That everybody in my country and throughout the world are entitled to a decent standard of living. And by the way, with the explosion of artificial intelligence and robotics, big issue. The jobs that people have today are not going to be there 10 or 15 years from now. Who's making those decisions? If artificial intelligence is going to increase worker productivity, who benefits from that? Is it going to be the owners of the technology, the corporations that use it, or will it be working people? With artificial intelligence and robotics, we really have the opportunity right now to improve the standard of living, not only of people in the industrialized world, but poor people all over the developing world.
It is the case that lately, or in the last few years, it is Donald Trump, billionaire, who seems to have created that niche where he has tapped into to working class American concerns in this area.
Well, one of the things that is certainly not only in the United States with Trump, and you're right, but it's all over Europe. I think what has happened is for millions of people all over the world, they perceive that their governments in a democratic society have ignored them. They're seeing the very rich getting richer, and they are hurting. They live in communities which are increasingly distressed. Their healthcare systems are inadequate. They can't afford education for their kids. They're breathing crappy air. They're worried about climate change. In my country, we have a dysfunctional healthcare system, etc. And they're saying, who is looking out for me? I'm hurting. Who's worried about my kids, my parents? And people like Trump and other demagogues come along and say, hey, look, basically democracy isn't working. All these guys do is they talk and they talk and they talk. Give me the power. I will do something. I will shake up the system. But what they are doing as demagogues, instead of taking on, obviously, the people who are the cause of the problems, the people who have the wealth, the people who have the power, what they are doing is fomenting dissent among people, tackling, taking on, dealing with dividing people over immigration, over racial issues, sexual orientation. They're trying to divide people. Some of us are trying to bring people together take on the powers that be.
You grew up yourself in a working class Jewish American family, and I noticed that you've tweeted recently about how can the US condemn Russia's bombing of civilians in Ukraine but fund Netanyahu's war machine. Can you see the Biden administration putting some kinds of restrictions on the use of its arms exports to Israel?
Well, among other things, that is what we are trying to, but it goes even deeper than that. The United States gives Israel about $3.5 billion in military aid every year. Right now, there is a foreign aid bill that was voted on just a few days ago, which included $14 billion for Israel. I strongly oppose that. I think what's going on in Gaza right now is a total humanitarian disaster. It is so horrible, it's almost unspeakable. And the idea that the United States of America would be complicit in that horror by giving this extreme right-wing government, Netanyahu and his racist friends there, even more money is unacceptable to me. So we are doing everything that we can to prevent the United States from providing military aid to Netanyahu.
Senator Bernie Sanders, thank you.
It's 9 minutes to 9. Matt, there are two sides to every story. As the mantra of journalists and factual storytellers pretty much everywhere. With the war in Ukraine, it's been very difficult, almost impossible, to tell the story from the Russian side. Not the high policy and the fantastical stories that Vladimir Putin's administration creates, but the everyday stories of Russian troops, young men very much like the Ukrainian ones they face across front lines. BBC correspondents have not been given permission by the Russian authorities to travel to Russian lines, but one filmmaker who has is Sean Langham, the only UK journalist to be given this kind of access. He's with us in the studio here. His film will be on ITV1 and ITVX this evening. Here's a taste.
Another new disturbing here for me, walking through these woods, these tree stumps, twisted wood, metal, dead bodies. Zelensky said this is horrible. That's what the Russian blockade looks like.
Sean, it's a tremendous achievement. Congratulations. You know people will have questions about ground rules, if there were any. Were there any editorial constraints placed upon you in exchange for access?
No, it's not that I imagine. I was aware at the time there were attempts to manage to try and keep it in check, but there was never any agreements made, and so I was sort of working around the constraints. I was never actually given an official end date, so it was a case of cat and mouse, really.
It's exhausting. You have, to say the least, extensive experience of reporting hostile environments and wars. What struck you most about this conflict?
Well, I'd never experienced anything like it in 30 years of covering conflicts, because the wars I'd covered, small conflict with America, Iraq, Britain, Afghanistan. This is industrial warfare, which I'd only seen growing up on programs like The World at War. And that little snippet you heard was near Avdiivka, this town that the Russians have just taken on the eastern front. 20 minutes from a city centre, anywhere in Ukraine can do this. You'll be having sushi, flat white, and a half an hour's drive you're sitting in a trench in squelching mud, looking across fields with all the trees just completely devastated. So it's industrial killing, which I've never experienced.
Did you get any idea while you were there of the strength or weakness of Russian forces, of Russian morale?
So it's always, I have to be careful what I'm saying, snapshot. But what I was aware was this dissonance. I was reading the Western media, and all my colleagues were on that side, and it was very accurate, truthful reporting. But I was aware of the headlines of, which I'd read before going out, of Russian low morale, these conscripts. When in fact, I met countless young soldiers who were volunteers, professional, not from the outer outskirts, former Soviet republics, and very professional. Not these sort of prisoners we've heard about were sent in as sort of cannon fodder by likes of Wagner. So I think we we've also had a slightly fragmentary picture of the war, albeit very accurate. There was I mean, my own experience confirmed, unfortunately, that the things you couldn't really see when you're on the ground with those sides, the other side.
John Langdon, thank you very much for coming in. Ukraine's war, the other side, is at 10:45 on ITV1 and ITV8.
It is now 5 to 9.
News of a new freight rail service might not normally quicken the blood, but this one may well tickle you because it's a start-up that hopes to recreate the night mail train. Black and white flashbacks to the mail train, immortalised in W.H. Auden's 1936 poem Night Mail. That was set to music by Benjamin Britten for a documentary by what was then the General Post Office, released that year.
This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner of the girl next door, pulling up feet took a steady climb, the gradients against her, but she's on time.
That really is immortal. Phil Reed, the former train driver, now CEO of Varenis Rail, hopes to set up the new service. Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm very, very well and delighted to be talking about trains at this hour. Why are you setting up this new service?
Well, as you just alluded to, I was driving trains a number of years ago, and I've had experience of driving the trains that we've just purchased, and it was about the green benefit, about the fully electric offering that these trains have, and they're very robust. They've done many years of great service, mainly on the Greater Anglian lines in the east of England, and you know, it's just about making better use of these trains as they came out of passenger use and bringing infrastructure around the UK that was used many years ago for this type of service back into purposeful use.
And the old night mail trains were actually sorting offices on wheels, weren't they? I mean, it wasn't just a question of lugging one thing from one end of the country to the other. There was actually sorting going on the train. Will that happen with yours? I mean, yours is parcels, not letters, isn't it?
It's parcels, and it can be anything, whatever any sort of large organisation wants to move. At the end of the day, we see this being a number of different ways of being able to offer a service that we've got. One of them being the sortation on trains, that time when goods and parcels are moving through the night, it can be seen as downtime, and we can try and offer a better way of using that time by making sure that the parcels and the goods that we carry can be sorted, ready for last mile deliveries the very next morning without going through another sortation process at another hub.
What I'm going to understand is where you're going to fit your trains on, because we keep hearing about how there is so little capacity on the rails, and here you are saying you're going to get a new freight service going.
Well, what's different about our freight service is that it's an express rail freight service. In essence, our trains can travel at speeds akin to that of passenger trains, so our trains can travel up to 100 miles an hour. They can fit in and integrate with passenger train services on the UK rail network, and that's allowed us to find spare capacities, so to say, in that we can, you know, integrate our service and not get stopped because we're slow, because we can actually keep up with the passenger trains that predominantly take up most of the capacity on the network. So that's where we've been able to find that capacity.
And leaving aside the environmental benefits, you are presumably delighted to be giving a boost to Britain's rail future.
Absolutely, this is a huge opportunity, I believe, for the UK rail industry. I'm a big advocate for it. I love what I do. I love driving trains. I'm still driving them very occasionally at the moment. But yeah, I think the railway has so much to offer with the infrastructure it has in place, both for running trains and for warehouse distribution on the UK rail network. And it's all electrified, it's all there, and it's all readily available to use.
That's fantastic. Phil, thank you very much indeed. That was Phil Reed, former train driver, now CEO of Varenis Rail, that hopes to set up a new night rail service.
Just a quick mention of something that we covered earlier. It's the BBC investigation into hidden waiting lists. It's on BBC News Online now, if you would like to have a look at it in more detail. That is it from us. Our editors today were Joshua Tyndall and Tom Smithard. The studio director was Shamini Ashton Griffiths. From Johnny and me and all the team, good morning.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. Israel has indicated that its forces might launch a ground offensive in Rafah in Gaza at the start of Ramadan in 3 weeks' time unless Hamas releases all hostages. International organisations have repeatedly raised concerns about more than 1 million civilians who are sheltering in Rafah. The mother of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been denied access to his body for a third day running as she tries to find out what caused his sudden death at a penal colony in the Arctic Circle. His widow, Yulia Navalnaya, is to address European foreign ministers in Brussels today. EU leaders say President Putin was personally responsible for Mr. Navalny's death. The School Leaders Union has described new government guidance on the use of mobile phones in schools in England as a non-policy for a non-problem. Ministers say the advice to avoid phone use during the school day will offer consistency and minimise disruption. The Association of School and College Leaders Union said most schools already had such policies. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, told Today it would help to protect youngsters.
To start to reset that conversation between teachers and children, and also parents and children, who will be empowered to say, well, you're not allowed this in school, it's obviously not good for you, it's something that you need to be cautious about. But it is something that we are going much further than many, many other countries, and we are open to doing what we can to make sure our children are protected.
BBC News has discovered that a significant number of patients in England are stuck on hidden waiting lists that don't show up in the official figures. People who are referred to specialists are no longer included on the main list, even though they may be waiting for follow-up treatment. The conditions affected include cancer and heart disease. A lightning bolt has knocked 4 people unconscious during a storm in the Australian city of Sydney. They were treated for burns and potential cardiac problems. And at last night's BAFTA Film Awards, the film Oppenheimer was the biggest winner, taking 7 prizes. It won Best Film, Best Director and Best Actor for Cillian Murphy. BBC News.
A BAFTA winner is the reader of our new book of the week in 45 minutes. Sir Simon Russell Beale will be reading from Chris Bryant's new work, telling the story of the last men in Britain to be hanged for sodomy in the year 1835. James and John, a true story of prejudice and murder, begins at 9:45. But now on Radio 4, it's Start the Week with Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Quite often, the subtitles on books tend to hedge the author's bets. The title goes all in, the subtitle qualifies or fudges things. Not on Ellen E. Jones's book Screen Deep. Her subtitle runs like this: How Film and TV Can Solve Racism and Save the World. She's with us to explain how that might work in practice and to talk about some of the films that have already started on the job. And with her to talk about how art can change our preconceptions and disrupt our prejudices, the director Noura Niassari. Her film Shida, about an Iranian mother and daughter in a woman's shelter, has been nominated for this year's Best International Film Oscar, not by Iran, but by Australia. And joining them, the artist Hugh Locke, whose captivating artwork Armada, a flotilla of ships, large and small, old and new, has just moored up inside the Royal Academy as part of their exhibition, Entangled Pasts on Art, Colonialism and Change. Ellen, if I can start with you, your title is obviously a provocation.
Yes.
How tongue-in-cheek is it?
I'm really having it both ways. I'm having my cake and eating it, because there is this kind of teasing of the sort of Hollywood grandiose mentality, which we're going to see a lot of in awards season, where people are patting themselves on the back and essentially crediting themselves with changing the world. And then, you look around you and you think, well, how much has actually changed? But at the same time, I do have this very sincere, earnest belief in the power of film and television and screen storytelling to change people's minds in a way that kind of news debates or reading opinion pieces in newspapers just doesn't have the same power, or social media arguments we do a lot of as well. Yeah.
You talk of yourself as a screen-raised kid.
Sorry,
we are reaching that point in history, though, where it's true of all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is the prevailing way in which we tell stories.
Yeah, and I think part of the book is kind of accepting that, whether we like it or not, Mr. Martin Scorsese, that these big films are kind of, that these big, Marvel films, or that they're very much part of the culture and very intrinsic to the culture, and that we therefore have to kind of be aware of and interrogate what kinds of messages they're sending out.
You quote the American writer Audre Lorde at one point, and she said this: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." She's wrong, isn't she? I mean, tools are usable by anybody who can get their hands on them.
Well, that's kind of one of the things that obviously that I'm looking into in the book, and that it has the question of getting your hands on the tools, though, has really been the problem for a lot of filmmakers of colour for the history of cinema. You know, it's only really in the last kind of 20, 30 years that, let's say, indigenous filmmakers have been making films and telling their own stories outside of activist documentaries which were happening in the 70s. Despite having been very much on screen in white filmmakers' films as part of westerns, in this very stereotyped, very narrow depiction since the very earliest films and filmmaking. So getting hold of the tools is very important. And then I do think that some of the tools themselves also need switching up.
Okay, well, we may come on to that. You finish with the book with a summary of 3 broad ways in which this task can be achieved, if it's achievable. Can you just run through them? The first is expanding our empathies, and I think we all get that. That's kind of very straightforward when we see lives on screen that aren't like our lives, and we understand.
Yeah, although I would just say that there's this kind of sort of narrow understanding of representation and why it matters, which I want to go beyond, which is this idea that if you can see it, you can be it, and that it's very important for kind of little brown children to see successful adults who look like them on screen. And I think good representation shouldn't be conflated with good character necessarily. But really good representation is about 3D depictions of humanity in all of its shades.
So but the empathies work in other ways too, as well, don't they? So that you can be a kind of 60-year-old white woman and see a young black kid in Peckham, and think maybe in Rye Lane.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I like saying is that, like, you know, those of us who have not seen ourselves on screen for a long time, whose identities have been marginalised, have that exercise of empathy that all